It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a special pleasure to speak to so many members of the scientific community of the future, because that's exactly who you are, and I hope you take that role seriously. I hope you enjoy that role as well. One never really knows how one is going to be introduced, so I figured I would introduce myself a little bit. I am a cell biologist. I work, as he said, on the structure and function of biological membranes. I'm at Brown University in Providence. We work on things like, in this case, the structure and organization of the endoplasmic reticulum membrane, part of the cell that's involved in the synthesis of proteins. And my lab was one of the very first to visualize the channel, which is now called the translocon, by which proteins enter the ER. That sounds very technical, but it was a very important problem in cell biology. Over the last few years, collaborating with a terrific guy named Joseph Levine, I've written a whole series of high school biology textbooks which are widely used around the country. The elephant book, but we have a couple of other books as well, including the dragonfly book, which is the most current book. And these are used in probably 35% of the high schools in the United States, which is a nice thing. My own daughter, in fact, Tracy, I have two girls. The oldest one is a wildlife biologist. The youngest one is a high school history teacher. And Tracy, the younger one, had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's book, the elephant book, in freshman biology in high school in Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we live. And I still remember one night, Tracy comes home for dinner, and we're all sitting around the table, and she says, "You know, Dad, because of you, I'm the envy of everybody in the high school biology class." And I thought that was really cool, because I thought, it's so rare that children ever compliment their parents for any reason whatsoever. And I thought this was one of those moments. And I threw my chest out, and I felt really good. And you saw how big that book was. And Tracy then went on and said, "Yeah, I'm the envy of everybody in the class because I'm the only one who doesn't have to lug that thing home at night." Because the other kids said, quote on, "Tracy doesn't, my dad wrote it. I got a copy at home. I don't have to bring it home." That was what we were good for, what we were used for. A couple of years ago, at the urging of quite a few people, I wrote a book on evolution and religion, which is called Finding Darwin's God. And the subtitle of that is A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution. I think there really is a great deal. And as it turns out, that book has been a surprising success in terms of not just my publisher, but also people writing to me and saying that what I wrote about here about science and religion connected with them. Now, evolution, as I'm sure you all know, is a controversial topic in the United States today. And just to pick one U.S. state, certainly not the only one where it's been controversial, I'd pick the state of Kansas. I actually spoke in Kansas just a couple of weeks ago. And some of you may know that 7 years ago, the Board of Education of the state of Kansas voted to entirely delete evolution from the state science requirements in Kansas. They simply took it out. That led to a popular outcry. These are newspaper headlines from the Times, and people were confused as to what this meant. What do we teach now? A lot of people thought that this was a controversial issue, therefore the schools were best left without it. Since then, every time there's been a school board election in the state of Kansas, evolution has been the issue on which the election turned. In 2004, an anti-evolution majority took control of the board, and they rewrote the standards. Back in 2000, a pro-evolution majority took control. This year, it looks like a pro-evolution majority will regain control of the board, and they will rewrite the standards again to make them consistent with the national science education standards. Kansas isn't alone in this. It turns out there are a lot of states in which evolution is indeed a major issue in the election. One of the candidates for governor in the state of Michigan right now has made evolution and something called intelligent design one of the key issues in the governor's election in that state. So we see this literally all around the country. And you might say that we live, as a result, in very interesting times. Some of you, if you read the newspaper closely, might remember that a few years ago, there was a county in Georgia called Cobb County. And Cobb County is not a rural county. It's the second largest school district in the state of Georgia. They adopted new biology textbooks. And the school board thought they were so dangerous that the textbooks had to have a warning sticker pasted on the inside to tell students that evolution was just a theory, not a fact. Don't get worried about it. And you might wonder, my God, what textbook was it that was so dangerous that it required a warning sticker on the inside? And sure enough, that's the book. And this is what the warning sticker actually said. And the sticker said, this textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. And I remember when that sticker went on, a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called me up, and she said, Dr. Miller, aren't you outraged at the sticker they've just put on your book? And I thought about that, and I've wondered, why did she phrase the question that way? And then I realized she probably wants to write an article with sort of an inflammatory headline. She's trolling for a quote, and she wanted to write an article that says, author slams Board of Education, or author is outraged, or even better, Northern author criticizes Board of Education. Something like that would go over well. And I decided I would not give her that satisfaction, and I wanted to have some fun. So I said, no, I like the stickers. She said, you do? And I said, yeah, I think the stickers are great. They just don't go far enough. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, the book has material on evolution. It's got a lot of other material too. Is evolution a theory? Of course it is. One of the chapters in my book is called Evolutionary Theory, so of course it's a theory. But when you say it's a theory, not a fact, you make it sound like theories and facts are opposite things, as if you're either one or another. And that's not the way we understand theories in science at all. So for example, I explained, let's suppose that a young person went to the University of Georgia and decided to study physics. One of the courses they'd have to take would be a course in atomic theory. Now, why do we call that atomic theory? If we get really certain about some atoms at some point in the future, will we change the name of that course to atomic fact? Well, the answer is of course not. We call it atomic theory because a theory is something that explains hundreds of thousands of facts. And atomic theory explains observational and experimental facts about the nature of matter. Evolutionary theory, in the same token, explains hundreds of thousands of observations and experimental facts relating to the nature of living things. That's what a theory is. But I told her that the sentence that really bugs me is the last one. And the last one says, this material, that means evolution, of course, approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. And she said, what are you, against open-mindedness? I said, no, you don't understand. You know what that third sentence tells students? It tells students we are certain of every single subject in this book except for one, and that's evolution. Now, I don't object to that as an evolutionist. I object to that as a cell biologist, because apparently what that tells you is if you study ecology, you don't need an open mind. And if you study biochemistry, you don't have to study carefully. And if you study cell biology, you don't have to apply critical analysis. And in fact, everything in science should be approached that way. So I said, I tell you what I'll do. No charge. I'll rewrite the sticker for the Cobb County Board of Education, and they can use the new sticker if they want. So the way I rewrote the sticker, as you can see right here, I would phrase it, this book has material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. That's the right way to consider it. Alas, they didn't take me up on this. They stuck with the stickers. They got sued. They went to court, and they lost. And the stickers were ripped out at the end of last summer. Now, even if you haven't taken a course in biology, you probably know that if you open just about any biology book, and mine is a pretty good example, you'll very quickly come to a chapter which tells you all about evolution. And we have this sort of thing as well. Why is it? Well, many biologists would say very simply that evolution is the central organizing theory of the biological sciences. A very famous biologist once wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Other people have said that without evolution, biology is just stamp collecting. Now, what they meant by that, and I used to be a stamp collector, so it's not a slur on stamp collectors, is that without evolution to tie things together, the characteristics of organisms are just a bunch of isolated facts. And what evolution actually does is to show how those facts fit together. So how do you explain evolution? I was thinking about that when I was preparing to meet you this morning. And one way to do it would be the way that Charles Darwin did, which is to write a book. And Charles Darwin explained evolution in The Origin of Species, depending upon the edition, that it's about 400, 455 pages. So one good way to spend much of the time in this lecture would be for me to open page 1 and start reading The Origin of Species. And I hope that at some time in your life, I'm not kidding about this, every one of you reads The Origin of Species. And the reason for that, I know it looks old and I know it looks dusty. This is a great book, and it is still a great book. And when you read books written, as this was 150 years ago, you find yourself connecting with the thought of somebody who lived at a different time, in a different society, in a different century, a different era. And you will connect with Darwin. Just read one chapter of it. You'll see exactly what I mean. But that would take a little long. So I thought, well, explain evolution in 455 pages, too long. We need a shorter time period. And where would you find a shorter time period? How about we explain evolution in 30 seconds of the sort that a poor, unsuspecting scientist might be asked to do if he went on the Colbert Report with Stephen Colbert. So here you're going to hear an explanation of evolution in 30 seconds. More to say, and if you want to see the rest of it, you can Google Ken Miller on the Colbert Report, and you'll find it somewhere on the internet for the entire 6-minute interview. But I want to come back to a couple of things that I said very briefly in that 30-second exchange about evolution. And that is one of the first things that people became aware of, which serves as the basis really for the theory of evolution, is the observation that life has changed over time. We take this for granted today, but it wasn't taken for granted in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a surprising and startling fact. Fossils are the record of that change. And not just fossils themselves, but where they're found, what fossils they're found in association with, and which layers they are found in. And fossils are not always fragmentary. In many cases, they are extraordinary records that tell us a great deal about what an organism looked like and even acted like, and in some cases, even what it ate, because in many cases, fossils preserve soft tissues, including the digestive system of these organisms. So that was, in a way, the first fact. The second startling fact was these changes occur in a pattern. This is one of those charts that nobody is ever actually supposed to be able to read, so don't worry about if you can't read it. But what has happened here is the geological periods are sketched over here, and the first appearance of major groups of organisms is shown here. So for example, microscopic organisms appeared literally billions of years ago, multicellular animals in the Ediacaran period about 700 million years ago, the first representatives of the vertebrates and others in the Cambrian, then jawless fish came later, bony fish, amphibians, insects, reptiles, dinosaurs appeared about here. Dinosaurs became extinct during the Cretaceous, mammals, birds, and actually the most recent major group of organisms at the phylum level to appear isn't us, it's not mammals, it's the flowering plants, the most common plants in the world. The flowering plants didn't appear until the Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago. So not only has life changed, but it has changed in a very particular pattern. And analyzing that pattern of change, it's very clear that the changes were successive. And what I mean by that is very simple. The first amphibian to appear looked more like a fish than any amphibian that has ever existed since. The first reptiles to appear looked more like amphibians than any reptiles that had ever existed since. And the very first mammals to appear look so much like reptiles that they actually are called the reptile-like mammals. And this notion of successive change impressed an awful lot of people well before Charles Darwin. When Darwin, as a young man, traveled around the world on a ship called the Beagle, he was struck by something that he called the succession of types. Got to remember, this guy grew up in England, never been off of the island of England. Suddenly he's in South America and he sees the weirdest animal that any European could ever hope to see, namely an armadillo. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen armadillos in the flesh. Travel to the southwestern United States and you'll have that pleasure. They serve armadillo, properly cooked, in all sorts of restaurants. It's a delightful treat, I can tell you about this. But it really struck Darwin. These are really weird animals. Now, in addition to studying them, sketching them, dissecting them, and yes, eating them, Darwin was struck by the fact that there were fossils that were unique to South America of organisms like this one called the glyptodont. These fossils looked remarkably like armadillos, even though they were much larger and they had many internal differences in their structure. And it struck Darwin, why should the extinct armadillo-like species that he found and armadillos themselves be found on just one continent? And that continent, he thought at the time, was South America. Why should they be found together? It suggested something. And what it suggested to Darwin was ancestry. The reason armadillos today are found on the continent where the most armadillo-like fossils are found is because these guys might have been the ancestors of these guys. Not just armadillos. There were extraordinary fossils which Darwin found of extinct giant sloths in South America, and lo and behold, the modern sloth, which is found in Central and South America, clearly is related to it. And Darwin wrote in a book that was published more than 20 years before The Origin of Species. This wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living, the fossil and the living, will, I don't doubt, throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on their Earth and their disappearance than any other class of facts. The fossil record shouted out that there was an ancestor-descendant relationship. Darwin was also a very experienced cultivator of plants and a breeder of animals. And he realized that vegetables that we think of as remarkably different, such as Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, have all been produced from the same ancestral wild mustard plant, believe it or not, by careful cultivation in the hands of plant breeders. So he realized that plants in nature show so much variation that a breeder can select for these different characteristics to produce plants that to us look completely different. And he realized that nature does exactly the same thing. And Darwin's insight was that there was a force in nature which he called natural selection, and that natural selection automatically selected for animals and plants that were best adapted to their environment. The variation that appears in nature is acted upon by natural selection. And Darwin put this sketch, it was the only picture in The Origin of Species, to illustrate how he thought his process would work. And that is, a species would develop increasing variation until finally it split into two, a process called speciation that results in the formation of new species. Once diversity divides the species into two, each of these new species can be acted on separately by natural selection. And this is where species come from. Contrary to popular imagination, evolution doesn't transform one species into another. It takes existing species and splits them into 2 or 3 separate species, which then go their own way and evolve in separate directions. What impressed Darwin was that he thought he could actually see this process in motion. On the Galapagos Islands, off the western coast of South America, he found a number of species of birds which clearly had different styles of life. Some of them were woodpecker-like, some of them were finch-like, some of them were warbler-like. He bagged these animals, meaning he shot them, preserved them, brought them back to England, and gave them to bird experts, and the bird experts told him, "You aren't going to believe this. That thing you thought was a woodpecker, it's a finch. The thing you thought was a warbler, it's a finch. The thing you thought was a finch, well, it is a finch." And it turns out that on these islands, there were no fewer than 13 different species of finch that in just a few million years had evolved from a single common ancestor that had flown to these distant islands from the South American mainland. Because these were the first birds to colonize it, these birds split and split and split again and were able to adapt to every one of these individual styles of life on the island. It's worth noting this same process is happening right now in various places throughout the world. For example, scientific reports of an insect called the walking stick in California have shown that walking sticks right now are splitting into 2 species, one of which prefers to hang out on one kind of plant and the other of which prefers to hang out on another type due to camouflage reasons. These species can these 2 populations can almost be considered separate species. And this sort of process, therefore, happens, and it happens today. Now, we're able to analyze, Darwin couldn't do this, what goes on by genetics. And genetics has shown us that these sort of isolating mechanisms, which divide species into 2, can develop in just a few years. In the case of fish, 60 or 70 years. In the case of mice, as few as a few hundred years, and in the case of flies and other microorganisms, perhaps just a few generations. So it's extraordinary that not only do these changes continue to take place, but we can study them with modern genetic mechanisms. Now, these ideas have implications. And the implications are that we ought to be able to look at the fossil record and find a record of common ancestry. It turns out we can't. We've known for years, for example, that swimming mammals like whales and dolphins have evolved from terrestrial mammals, and they did so about 80 or 90 million years ago. And it turns out that the oldest known living whale, the oldest known fossil whale, up to about 20 years ago, which was called Basilosaurus, and this is a Basilosaurus skeleton, is remarkably transitional It doesn't have a blowhole. It still breathes from the very tip of the nose. It actually has tiny little hind legs, or a pelvic girdle here, concealed inside the skeleton. So it clearly is an intermediate form. But a lot of people who might be critical of evolution might say, yeah, well, if this really happened, where are the intermediates? Well, that's a good question. It turns out that about 15 years ago, a group of investigators in the Middle East began to discover fossils that clearly were whale-like fossils. And once they realized that this was where this evolutionary process took place, they began to look harder. And when they looked harder, they found a series of fossils that were remarkably intermediate. Fossils that clearly were terrestrial organisms that had begun to adapt to the ocean. So how many different species did they find? 1 or 2 to plug up the gaps? Well, no fewer than 5. And recent estimates suggest perhaps a dozen or more. And we now understand in great detail how mammals made the transition back to the water and where modern whales and dolphins came from. And it's an evolutionary process that we understand, not completely, because we don't understand anything completely in science, but we certainly understand it well enough to know that evolution drove the change. And this sort of discovery occurs all the time. This is an article, April of this year, from the Wall Street Journal, pointing out that new discoveries continue to answer questions on evolutionary theory. And in this case, it was the spectacular discovery of an intermediate fossil in the Canadian Arctic that shows very clearly how the fins of lobed fin fishes evolved into the forelimbs of terrestrial or land-dwelling vertebrates. So the intermediate forms continue to show up. And we can look at the fossil record anywhere and see examples of new species formation. Here, for example, is the development of a new species that actually turns out to be a diatom by this process of diversification, exactly what Darwin suspected in the fossil record. And this species became increasingly diverse around 3.5 million years ago, split into 2. These 2 species went their separate ways, and as it turns out, they are both still with us today. So we see examples like this all the time. But if you're really passionately interested in evolution, you might say, well, you know, that's a diatom. I mean, nobody really cares about diatoms. Show me a species that I'm really interested in. So I figured I would do that today. What you see here is the fossil record of another species. Looks remarkably similar to the last one. And just like it, in this case, about 2 million years ago, it underwent a diversification. It split into 2 major lines. They existed side by side for about 1 million years. This one went extinct. This one continued to evolve, and what you see here is the size of a very important organ in all of these species. And as you can see, this guy is still with us to the present day. Now, I don't know if this looks familiar to you or not, but it should. And the reason for that is it's us. What you're looking at is a fossil record showing the development of the brain size in human beings. We make an arbitrary split between the Australopithecines and our genus Homo. That split occurred about 2 million years ago. Human beings, or pre-humans, lived side by side with Australopithecines for about 1 million years before they went extinct, and we might have had something to do with that. And the line leading to us showed a rapid increase in brain capacity in just the last 1 million or so years. Many people who are critical of evolution literally refuse to believe that we have intermediate fossils that connect us to our pre-human ancestors, but we certainly do. And every year we discover more of them. And these are not fragmentary remains. These are not bits of a jawbone or a piece of a tooth. In many cases, they are complete skulls that show us a great deal about these individuals and a great deal about what they were capable of. One of these skulls was reported in the journal Nature several years ago. It's called Kenyanthropus, the guy on this side. And when I opened the issue of Nature, I saw a summary in the paper showing not just Kenyanthropus, which is right here, but showing all of the fossil species, who is related to whom, or who we think is related to whom. And these are species that lived in just the last 5 million years leading to us. And I opened this, and I looked at this, and I had one of those really weird moments. I looked at it and said, I've seen that before. Where have I seen it before? How could I have seen it before? Because this is the latest issue of a scientific journal. They must have drawn this diagram up. But I was positive that I had seen that diagram before, and I couldn't imagine what it was. So I thought about it. Yeah, I got better things to do. Went to sleep. Woke up the next morning. I don't know when I do my good thinking when I'm unconscious or not, but I woke up the next morning and I thought, I know where I saw it before. I saw it before in The Origin of Species. Unintentionally, that summary of the human fossil record is literally a dead ringer for that back of the envelope sketch that Charles Darwin put in The Origin of Species. This was his sketch as to what evolution would look like if we could capture all the intermediate forms and visualize all of the evolutionary speciation events. Lo and behold, what we know right now around our own species matches that in a way that I think Darwin would never have anticipated. So the human fossil record turns out to be an almost perfect match for Darwin's rough, back-of-the-envelope sketch of evolution. Now, we live, as all of you know from your education, in a molecular age. And so far, I've just been talking about fossils. So a fair question is, what about the molecular evidence? Does it support the idea of evolution? This is the cover of the scientific journal Nature, published almost exactly a year ago today. And it has in it the chimpanzee genome DNA sequence. And these are a few lines from one of the papers in this issue. And I wanted to show you what one of the authors who worked on this study actually wrote. And what he wrote is that more than a century ago, Darwin posited that humans share recent common ancestors with the great apes in Africa. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. So molecular studies support it, and they support it in a very dramatic way. Now, as I'll tell you after the break, today is a special day for me because exactly 1 year ago, I was on the stand being cross-examined in a trial on the issue of evolution in federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And at that trial, we had to decide how were we going to bring this brand new evidence, because it was only a couple of weeks old at the time, into the courtroom in a way that would make this dramatic point with the judge. So I want to show you how we did this, as molecular evidence can be complicated. Let's take the hypothesis of common ancestry, namely the hypothesis that we share a common ancestor with chimps, orangs, gorillas, and the other great apes. Now, the fossil evidence for this is overwhelming. The anatomical evidence is good. The genetic evidence is extremely strong. But you know, there's something funny about it. We human beings have 46 chromosomes. All the other great apes have 48. Now, if you studied biology, and I think most of you have, you know that those 46 chromosomes we have are actually 23 pairs. Each of you got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. Baby chimp gets 24 pairs, 24 from mom, 24 from dad. So where's our missing chromosome pair? What happened to it? Is it possible that in the line that led to us, a pair of chromosomes just went missing, just got tossed out? The answer to that is no. We know way too much about primate genetics. The loss of a whole chromosome pair would be fatal. Be fatal in us, be fatal in gorilla, be fatal in the orangutan. You wouldn't even get past embryonic development if you lost all the genes on a whole chromosome. So the only possibility is that during the evolution of the line that led to us, one of the pairs of chromosomes in one of these pre-human ancestors must have gotten fused together, must have gotten stuck. So instead of having 24 pairs, 2 of them are stuck together in us. That's why we have 23. Now that, as it turns out, is a testable prediction, meaning that we ought to be able to look at the human genome and find that fused chromosome somewhere in our DNA. And if we can't find it, then the hypothesis of common ancestry might be wrong. So we have now go to the human genome, scan around, and see if we can find a chromosome that sort of shows the Scotch tape that holds together 2 pieces of other chromosomes. Let's see if we can do that. Now, how would we recognize that? Well, a biology student will tell you it's much easier than you might think, and here's why. Chromosomes have at their tips special DNA sequences called telomeres, only found at the tip. Near the center, they have special sequences called centromeres. If in the lineage leading to us, 2 primate chromosomes got stuck together, you know what you'd have? You'd have a chromosome with telomeres in the middle where they don't belong. And you would also have a chromosome with 2 centromeres. So that's what we're looking for. So now we're going to look at the human genome and see, do we have a chromosome with telomeres in the center and 2 centromeres? And if we don't have it, this common ancestry thing might not be true. Well, it turns out we do. It's chromosome number 2. And this is a paper published last year in Nature showing that our human chromosome, let me read you from the paper, even though it's sort of technical. Chromosome 2 is unique to the human lineage of evolution. It emerged as a result of head-to-head fusion of 2 chromosomes that are still separate in other primates. We know the precise fusion site. It's at base 114,455,823. We know the exact base pair where the Scotch tape is hanging out. We've got the extra telomeres right here, and lo and behold, there are 2 centromeres. One of them is inactivated. The inactivated one corresponds to chimp chromosome 13. The active one corresponds to chimp chromosome 12. What does this mean? It means that we are descended from common ancestors with the other great apes that had 48 chromosomes, and we can see that lineage in chromosome number 2 where the fusion points come together. Is there any way to interpret this factual data as being evidence for an intelligent designer or the spontaneous creation of our species out of nothing? The answer to that is no, unless you're willing to think of a designer who wanted to fool us by giving us a chromosome that only looked like it had been descended by pasting these two guys together. And if you want to believe in a super force that is so deceptive, we'll go ahead and do it, but it certainly isn't a scientific point of view. Now, what I'd like to do right now is to take a break, answer a few questions, and after you guys get an opportunity to ask a few questions, basically I want to tell you about what happened in that courtroom in the trial that began a year ago yesterday. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to your questions. Don't forget, we have substantial bribes, and if no hands go up, I'm taking them all home. Okay, you sir, an orange shirt.
How does the evolutionist theory fit in with your religion?
Okay, you ask sort of the big question, which is, how does the evolutionist theory fit in with my religion? I think it fits in extremely well, and what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is to sort of defer that a little bit. And at the end of the lecture, if you're still interested in that, I'll show you another clip from the Stephen Colbert show in which he asked the religious question. But the way I would put it is this way. What evolution tells us is that our species has a natural origin. In other words, we come out of the same process of nature and everything else. Well, if you read Scripture, Genesis tells us you are made out of the dust of the earth. Well, that's what evolution tells us too. In other words, we have a lowly origin. And in the Western scriptural tradition, God or Allah reminds us of that constantly, that we are made out of the dust of the earth. That's what evolution says as well. Having a natural process to account for our origins, to me, is no more theologically threatening than realizing that the phases of the moon or the apparent movement of the sun are natural processes as well, even though in olden times people attributed those to the direct action of God. So I don't want to get into detailed theology, but in a general way, the problem, theologically, as far as I'm concerned, was solved by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And Aquinas, who was one of the great Christian writers, his great insight was that God, if he exists, is the cause of causes. So showing that something has a natural cause doesn't take it out of the overall plan of that divine force. And to me, that's how evolution fits in. I can talk more about that later if you want. The right-hand corner, all the way over here. Yeah.
When you were talking about the chimpanzee, you said that their chromosomes that fused together was 12 and 13. But when you were talking about the humans, you said that the fused one was in 2. How did it skip up to number 2?
Well, the answer is, don't forget, we're the human beings, so we're the guys who do the numbering, okay? And we number human chromosomes. Number 1's the biggest. Number 2 is a little smaller. Number 3, number 4. So we numbered them by size. We actually made a mistake. The smallest human chromosome is 21. But 22 looks smaller to the first people who did the numbering, so we got those numbers messed up. The primate chromosomes have been numbered exactly the same way. So chimp, and for that matter gorilla and orang chromosomes 12 and 13 are the 13th and the 12th smallest. When they were fused together, they became bigger, right? So that's why the number changed. And when this work was done, primate geneticists all of a sudden realized the chromosomes we've been calling in other primates, 12 and 13, don't correspond to 12 and 13 in human beings. They correspond to the 2 parts of number 2. So in the Chimpanzee Genome Project, geneticists have now renamed the chimpanzee chromosomes. So what used to be called 12 and 13 are now called 2A and 2B. That way they line up, because the genes line up in a dramatic fashion with the genes on human chromosome number 2. So retrospectively, after that paper, we've changed the numbering system. Other question? Right in the back.
Is it possible that our human species is evolving or will evolve in the future?
That's a good question, and it's one I hear a lot. Are we still evolving? Well, here's what you need for evolution to take place. 2 things. One is you need variation within a species. Okay, look around. We've got one species in here. There's a lot of variation: height, weight, hair color, skin color, eye color, blood type. So we have plenty of variation in our species. And the second thing you need is differential reproductive success, meaning some people will leave more children than others. This will tell you exactly how old I am. In a couple weeks, I'm going to go to my 40th high school reunion. And I've been emailing and corresponding with some of my old high school classmates. I have 2 kids. A couple of my friends have 3. I've found over the internet a couple who have none, and one of my classmates has 12. That is what I would call differential reproductive success. And what that means is we've got variation, we've got differential reproductive success. That's all you need for evolution. Now, can I predict where evolution is taking us? The answer is no. Evolution is an inherently unpredictable process, but evolution clearly is going to continue on our species, even though science has enabled us to sort of manipulate our own evolution to some extent, and I wouldn't be so bold as to predict how that will end up, but evolution is clearly going to continue. Okay, let's see, where's the young lady right here?
Do you think it is likely that eventually another species will come to be the dominant species instead of humans?
That's a good question. In other words, how long are we going to occupy this planet? I grew up in the 1950s, and when I went to school, we had air raid drills. And we had to go under our desks and duck and cover because we thought the Russians were going to come over and bomb us any moment. And therefore, in popular fiction, even on television, people speculated about our species through nuclear war, bombing ourselves into extinction. Unfortunately, that's still a possibility. Let me speak, however, strictly, not as a politician, but strictly as a biologist. The average duration for a mammalian species, for a mammal, in the fossil record, according to a paleontologist at the University of Chicago named Jack Sepkoski, is 2.6 million years. Our species has been on this planet, depending on when you trace the ancestry of our species, probably about a million and a half years. So far, we've got about 1 million years to go to reach the average length of a mammalian species. But that same study of the fossil record says that no mammal species has survived unchanged for more than 5 or 6 million years. So as a biologist, what I would say is the way of all species is emergence through evolution and extinction. Might that occur to us? It might. I have a feeling you and I will not live to see it, but predicting the future, except by reference to the fossil record, is always pretty dangerous. Okay, right there.
You said before that about the chromosome that's inactive in humans.
I don't think I said anything about an inactive chromosome.
Well, about the fused chromosome,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sorry. And what part did that play in our development?
The answer might surprise you. Probably none. And the reason for that is we can study chromosome fusions, which occur all the time, in laboratory mice, in fruit flies, and Drosophila, and other organisms. And for the most part, the fusing of 2 chromosomes together doesn't have a very profound genetic effect. So the fusing of primate chromosomes 12 and 13 to produce human chromosome number 2 probably had very little to do with what makes us human. In other words, when you actually line up the primate chromosomes 12 and 13 with ours, you find that most of the genes match. And the fusion site really has very little influence on gene expression. So very often when I talk about that, someone will get up in the audience and challenge. It's not what you did, but someone will get up in the audience and challenge and say, how could the fusion of 2 chromosomes change a chimpanzee into a human being? And the answer is, it can't. But this is simply a fortuitous, a lucky genetic rearrangement that occurred in the line that led to us that enables us to look at our own DNA and see where it came from. And in this case, we clearly came from an organism in which those 2 parts of chromosome number 2 were separate, and we can look around and we see where those organisms are. They're the great apes. So I want to thank you for your questions. I'll take some more. At the end. And now what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about that trial. The trial involved events that took place in Dover, Pennsylvania. Dover is a small town. This is a high school that graduates about 150 kids a year. There are 4 high school teachers in Dover, that's all. And the reason I put the cover of my textbook up there was because in 2004, the teachers at Dover High decided that they wanted to buy new biology textbooks for their students. That's the book they picked. They then had to have this approved by the local school board. This is not the state of Pennsylvania, this is just the town of Dover. And a number of school board members didn't like the book. One of them was named William Buckingham, and he said what he didn't like about this book was that from beginning to end, this book is laced with Darwinism. You know how authors try to sell books by putting little quotes on the back jacket to tell you how good they are? Well, Joe Levine and I, my co-author, we're thinking about putting this on the back jacket of that book because we think under certain circumstances it might help us to sell books. But Mr. Buckingham and other board members persuaded the board to instruct the teachers in Dover to start preparing intelligent design lessons in schools. As this case moved along, an awful lot of people said, wait a minute, this isn't a scientific issue the board is pushing, this is a religious issue. And as I mentioned, a trial took place about a year ago. A whole series of expert witnesses showed up in that trial. And I had the honor, if you want to call it that, of being sort of the first expert witness in the trial. It started a year ago yesterday. I figured that I would testify on Monday, get cross-examined, fly back to Providence, and give the lecture, which I always do Tuesday at 1 o'clock in my cell biology course. I had no problem. But my cross-examination went on and on and on, and I had to be on the stand for 2 days. So I emailed this article from Science Magazine to all the students in the class so they'd understand the reason I had to cancel Tuesday's lecture wasn't because I was on a ski trip or vacation, but I was actually tied up in court, and they thought that was okay. I emailed them the link to the report about my testimony in the New York Times. They thought that was okay. But I have to tell you, they were not really impressed until they saw that the trial was being reported in what is, for you, I'm sure, and for today's college students, the ultimate news source. And that turned out to be The Daily Show. And as soon as they saw that Jon Stewart was reporting on the trial, they decided, that's cool, this is important, it's okay for the professor to be there. The trial lasted more than 7 weeks. As one person pointed out, in fact, it was the judge who pointed this out, the trial lasted 40 days. Think about that. And that's how, and then the judge had to render his decision. And the decision, which came out in December of last year, was a stinging rebuke of intelligent design. It simply slapped down the Board of Education. It was an extraordinary decision, and it's well worth reading. The case is actually called Kitzmiller, K-I-T-Z Miller. That was the name of the lead plaintiff, Tammy Kitzmiller, K-I-T-Z Miller. Kitzmiller v. Dover. You can find it on Google very easily. The decision is extremely easy to read. And this judge, who incidentally is a Republican conservative judge appointed by President George W. Bush and praised during his confirmation hearings as a strict constructionist, which he is, this judge wrote an exceptional opinion. Now, what happened in the trial was remarkably interesting, and there were many cartoons. You can't take pictures in federal court. This is the New Yorker's caricature of a fellow named Michael Behe who testified in defense of the school board being cross-examined. This is MSNBC's sketch of me in the courtroom being cross-examined in front of the judge by the lawyers to the other side. And the key in the trial was making the case for evolution. And I wanted to have a few things to say about exactly how we did that. Now, I've talked about this thing called intelligent design, which was the theory that was presented as an alternative to evolution. So what is intelligent design? Religious people of all stripes believe that there really is an intelligent design to the universe, which is the work of the Creator. And for what it's worth, that's what I happen to believe myself. But this is actually, in this context, not what is meant by intelligent design. Intelligent design, in terms of this argument, means something else. And it is the claim that design, and what is meant by design here is outside supernatural puff of smoke intervention, is required to account for the origins of living things. That means that intelligent design, or ID as I will call it, is actually a doctrine of special creation. Species appear because a creator makes them. And in this respect, it's really nothing newer than good old-fashioned creationism, sort of spiffed up to make it sound scientific and to appear non-religious. So I want to tell you how people go about arguing for this. One of their principal claims is that evolution cannot explain the origin of complex biochemical machines. That's a bacterium, and the little whips you see coming out of one end are called flagella. A lot of bacteria, including E. coli, in your stomach right now, have little flagella. These flagella are enormously complex, and they spin around like crazy to propel this bacterium through liquids of all sorts, including ones inside your body. Now, the argument is that these flagella, which at a molecular level are really quite complex and quite beautiful, possess something called irreducible complexity. And that means that even in principle, they just couldn't have been produced by evolution. That's the argument. So if evolution couldn't have produced them, they must have been designed or they must have been produced in a puff of smoke creation. And Michael Behe, who did testify in the trial for the school board, says you can't produce irreducibly complex systems by modifying a previous system. That's how evolution would do it, because any precursor to one of these complex systems that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. If the flagellum has 30 proteins and you're missing 2 or 3 or 4, it doesn't work. And therefore, evolution could not gradually have produced 10 parts, 15, 20 parts, knowing that a couple million years in the future these parts would be useful. They got to be useful right now. That's true, by the way. And therefore, it couldn't have produced this flagellum. That's the argument. Now, in case people don't get this flagellum, Dr. Behe likes to make an analogy to a mousetrap. And some of you may have noticed, I'm sure that all of you lead such vermin-free lives that you've probably never seen a mousetrap. But I brought one along with me. And a mousetrap has 5 parts. It's got a base plate, bait holder, a little hammer, a spring, and then a catch. And it's true that if you take any of these parts away, the mousetrap seemingly will not work. So all these parts have to be together at the same time in order to have function. And as Dr. Behe has written, all the components have to be in place before you can catch any mice. Therefore, it's irreducibly complex, just like the bacterial flagellum. Now, putting it in a more graphic way, the machine itself, whether it's a flagellum, whether it's a mousetrap, or whether it's some other combination of proteins, has a function. And that function can be favored by natural selection. But the individual parts, he argues, don't have any function until you put them all together. Because of that, they couldn't have evolved. And what he has written is, since natural selection requires a function to select, no argument there, it's true, an irreducibly complex biochemical system would have to arise all at once for natural selection. That, as you'll see, is not true. But that's the argument for all of this. So putting it again graphically, if you have a complex machine, it has a function that can be favored by natural selection. But the individual parts have no function. Therefore, they cannot be shaped by natural selection. Therefore, this machine couldn't have evolved. Therefore, proof of the designer. Well, that's pretty powerful. How does evolution explain that? Well, the way that evolution explained it, and Darwin actually explained it as well, is that's a false view. These complex machines actually arise from simpler machines with limited numbers of parts, and the components themselves originate with different functions. As these parts get put together, new functions emerge, and the final function emerges only when you put the parts together. So natural selection can work on these all the way through. Now, that's not evidence, that's just an argument. But the cool thing about this, it enables you to test this argument by holding these two up. If the intelligent design guys are right, the parts of these complex machines should be useless on their own. But if evolution is right, these parts should turn out to do other jobs in the cell. So let's check it out. Let's see exactly what happens. Let's start with that bacterial flagellum. There it is, and this is from a biochemical review article. It's got about 30 different proteins, so let's do an experiment. Let's take away not one part, not 2 or 3. Let's take away all but 10 of its parts. Now, the cool thing about computers is they make these experiments really easy. Watch this. Whoops, there they go. So I've taken away all but 10 parts, and the 10 I've left are the 10 that span the biological membrane. Here is another review showing exactly what these 10 parts are. Well, if intelligent design argument is right, then what's left behind, because we've taken all these parts away, this should be non-functional. But it turns out it's not non-functional. These 10 proteins perform to the cell that has them an absolutely vital function that has nothing to do with flagellar motility. They make something up called the type 3 secretory system, which is a little molecular syringe that really nasty bacteria use to pump our cells full of poisons and to kill them. Now, these 10 parts have nothing to do with flagellar movement, but they are still functional. So what does that do to the argument? Remember what the argument was. Any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. There's the complex system. This guy is missing 20 parts Is it non-functional? It is perfectly functional. So what that tells us is this statement, which is not a peripheral one, this is the heart and soul of the intelligent design argument. It tells us that statement is wrong. There is no other word for it. And it turns out when we analyze the bacterial flagellum itself, these are the proteins associated with the type 3 secretory apparatus, but it turns out just about every other protein in the flagellum actually has a function of its own in a system elsewhere in the cell unrelated to flagellar movement. And you know what that means? It means that when we actually analyze the flagellum, it fits the evolution prediction, which is that the parts should have functions of their own. And so they do. Now, the flagellum is not the only argument where this breaks down. These guys make the same argument about the complex series of proteins that clot the blood. If you are missing even one of these proteins, your blood doesn't clot properly. That part is true. So the argument is made that these proteins are only used to clot blood. In the absence of any of the components, blood does not clot and the system fails. Evolution, therefore, couldn't have produced it because it would have to produce all the parts at the same time rather than to produce a few gradually. And in fact, the textbook called Pandas and People that is used for intelligent design classes makes exactly the same argument. You need all the parts in working order. All the proteins have to be present simultaneously or blood clotting doesn't work. It's a bold claim, and it would be a powerful argument against evolution if it were true, but it ain't. And it turns out we can do an experiment and check. Here is a drawing showing all these complicated proteins. So let's eliminate one component. And I'm going to pick a protein called factor 12. Very important because it actually starts the cascade. So let's eliminate it. Again, these experiments are easy to do in PowerPoint. There they go. It's gone. Will the blood clot? Well, the answer turns out to be yes. Whales and dolphins, in fact, lack factor 12 right at the molecular level. They don't have the gene for it. This turns out to be an adaptation for deep sea diving. But it also means that they can miss a component and their blood doesn't clot. Well, maybe they got it wrong. Maybe you can eliminate one component. Okay, fair enough. So let's go a little farther and let's eliminate 3 parts. And the 3 parts I want to eliminate are this entire cascade up here. Now let's see what happens. Well, it turns out that pufferfish lack all 3 of these parts. There's a pufferfish for those of you who haven't gone fishing recently. And it turns out they are lacking all of these components, and guess what? They have a perfectly functional clotting system. So once again, the core of this argument, which is that in the absence of any of these components, blood will not clot and the system fails, sorry, it's wrong. So all of these biochemical arguments fall apart. And actually, when you look at these systems in detail, we can actually, by comparative genetic analysis, see where the parts of the clotting system came from in very simple chordate animals. And we're finding more and more about the evolutionary pathway that really did produce blood clotting all the time. Now here's the question. Why does this fail? It sounded, look at the mousetrap. It sounded like such a good argument. You need all the parts or it doesn't work at all. Well, 5 or 6 years ago, I was on a television program on PBS called Firing Line, hosted by a guy named William F. Buckley, where they have these debates. And Michael Behe was there. He had a mousetrap. He made the argument about the mousetrap. I had a mousetrap in my briefcase and a pair of pliers. And to his absolute horror, I pulled the mousetrap out, pair of pliers, I yanked one of the parts off the mousetrap and threw it away. I bent one of the other parts, and I still got the mousetrap to work. That was after his argument, you take a part away, mousetraps don't work. So I want to show you, I'm very proud of this. One of my great scientific achievements. What I did was I took out the bait holder. And as it turns out, if you take the hold down bar and you twist it, so it just goes under the spring, you have a 4-part mousetrap. And lo and behold, if you have a really stupid mouse, and he comes up and bumps this to the side when he takes the bait, the hammer goes down and he'll be just as dead as if he was killed with a 5-part mousetrap. So it's not true that the 4 parts wouldn't have a function. I thought it was pretty clever. But then I got an email about a week later from a guy at University of Delaware named John McDonald. He's the clever guy. John said, "Dear Ken, I liked your 4-part mousetrap demonstration on the TV show. Nice job. But why just stop there? Why didn't you take another part away to make a 3-part mousetrap, which would also hold bait and catch mice? And when that had sunk in, take another part away. You can make a perfectly good 2-part mousetrap. Mouse comes over, bumps the cheese. This thing comes down. And finally, the ultimate, which is the 1-part mousetrap." And therefore, this argument about all the parts having to be there is fictitious. Now, there's a better point than that. Some of you may have noticed that I've been wearing what you think is a mousetrap as a tie clip. Well, it's actually not a mousetrap. I've taken 2 parts and thrown them away. So I only have 3 parts here. I have the base plate, the spring, and the catch. You can't catch many mice with this, but it makes a perfectly functional, if not very elegant or attractive, tie clip. And that's the point, which is that the parts of a supposedly irreducibly complex machine can be used for different purposes. And in fact, if you have just 2 parts, you can even make a keychain out of Mousetrap. And I'll be selling these later on the way out in case you'd like to buy any of these. So the point to be made is the mousetrap, ironically, is a perfect argument for evolution because it shows how the parts of what is supposedly an irreducibly complex machine can actually be used for other purposes. And you can look at what some of these other purposes are directly in the slide, and you might like to try some of them yourself with the permission, of course, of your parent or guardian. So the mousetrap example unexpectedly provides a perfect argument in favor of evolution. Now, the last thing that happened at the Dover trial is it exposed intelligent design as a religious doctrine masquerading as science, and a very particular religious doctrine at that. How did we establish that? Was it by the expert testimony on our side of the case? Actually, no. It turned out that the best argument for that was the expert testimony on the other side of the case. And that is, when we got the expert witnesses for the other side on the stand, look what they said. Behe said it's implausible that the designer is natural, therefore he's got to be supernatural. Another witness said that for intelligent design to be considered science, we got to change the ground rules of science so that supernatural forces can be counted as part of science. And another witness said the whole idea of ID is to change the ground rules of science so that it includes the supernatural. We didn't have to make the case. It was just a question of putting these guys in the stand and just keep talking. Tell us all about it. And lo and behold, supernatural forces, as many religious people might say, might be real, but they're certainly not part of science. So considering them as science, I think, profanes religion and corrupts science. There was a perfect example of that during the trial. Dr. Behe was questioned about how if you change the ground rules of science so that supernatural forces needed for intelligent design can be considered science, wouldn't it mean that other forces can be counted as scientific as well? And in particular, it was pointed out to him that astrology would fall as a science by his definition. And to everyone's absolute astonishment, when he was asked this question, he agreed with the assertion that under his definition, astrology would count as a science and could be taught in scientific classrooms. Whenever I speak to gatherings of teachers or lay people interested in education, I always try to remind them that the leading scientific expert in favor of intelligent design, under oath at the Dover trial, got on the stand, and lo and behold, he said that if intelligent design is considered science, so is astrology. I don't think that's where we want to take the scientific classrooms in this country, especially when we are involved in an international competition that will determine whether or not the United States remains the leading scientific nation in the world. I don't think teaching astrology in the science classroom is going to be the key to our retaining worldwide leadership in science. There's another point that you hear sometimes as well, and that is the scientific community is biased against intelligent design, and we don't treat new ideas. We suppress them. We keep them out. So it's only fair to put intelligent design in the classroom. What this argument overlooks is the fact that science deals with novel scientific ideas all the time. It's the lock, it's sort of the stock, lock, and barrel of science. It's the sort of thing that we love to have. So what happens with a new idea, with a novel scientific claim? Well, the people who back it go out and they do research. They subject that research to peer review. And peer review means you write, you come to meetings, you argue, you debate, you accept criticism, you do counter experiments. In short, you try to establish that your idea has the evidence behind it and that it's useful. And eventually, if you really have the evidence behind you, you'll win a scientific consensus. And then quite automatically, these new ideas get into classroom and textbook. Just as an example, 6 years ago, the notion of a process called RNA interference as being responsible for genetic regulation was unheard of. Then all of a sudden the evidence behind it began to mount, and it is now clear that small interfering RNA molecules play a major role in development, differentiation, and gene expression. Textbook writers everywhere, and I'm one of them, are now putting this material into the textbooks. Not because state boards of education required it, but because the scientific community reached a consensus that this process is important. Now, the people who advocate intelligent design like to say, we got a new scientific theory too. Be fair to us. That's cool. If they wanted to go through this process, I'd say, great. See you at the next Biochemical Society meeting. See you at the cell biology meetings. Let's look at your evidence. Let's subject it to peer review. But do you know what they want to do? They don't like this. They think this process is too messy and too time-consuming. Their idea of how things should work is actually more like this, which is to be directly injected into classroom and textbook. And wherever they have gotten the attention of boards of education or legislatures, they have consistently acted to short-circuit the very process of science. I would argue then, far from being unfair to exclude this idea from the curriculum, it's actually unfair to include it without making it go through the process of review, debate, evidence, and experimentation that every other scientific idea, including evolution, has had to go through in order to get into classroom, textbook, and curriculum. Intelligent design, creationism, in my view, is not rejected, as some people say, because it has religious implications. I think a lot of ideas have religious implications, and they still find their way into science. The reason these ideas are rejected is far simpler, and the headlines from these scientific papers tell you exactly what that reason is. And that is that these ideas have been rejected by the scientific and the science education community for a far simpler reason. And that reason is because the evidence shows it's wrong. Thank you. Thanks for your attention. Now, I was asked a question that I sort of deferred earlier on, like, how do you fit this in with your religious views? And I told you that Colbert had asked me that question, and I figured, I'll show you my... So I hope that's a more detailed answer to your question. Okay. Sir, in the striped shirt.
Over time, like larger mammals, they became gradually smaller as they evolved. Is there a reason for this, or because I was reading an article yesterday, and is there we had like the giant sloth, and we don't have giant sloths anymore. Is there a reason to this?
Okay, well, what you're asking me about is there an evolutionary trend to make animals smaller? Okay, so I got a question for you. Sorry to throw the question back at you. What's the largest animal that has ever lived? Anybody else know? Blue whale. Okay, it's still here. So not all evolutionary trends reduce the size of animals. And it depends upon local circumstances and nutritional circumstances. There's actually a very well understood trend in ecology and evolution that when large animals find themselves on very isolated islands with limited food sources and other evolutionary pressures, they tend to get smaller. And the reason for that, of course, is a smaller animal has fewer metabolic demands, can get by with less food, and you might be in a limited area where that actually happens. But evolutionary trends go in both directions. They go towards the larger and they go towards the smaller. So I don't think any one trend characterizes evolution. And the persistence of the blue whale alive today, the largest animal that has ever existed, I think is a good indication of that. Okay. Right there, sir?
How long do you think it might take for the whole debate over evolution to be resolved?
How long do I think it would take for the debate over evolution to be resolved? My short answer is not in my lifetime. This is something that people have been kicking around for a long time. And it's not a uniquely American debate either. It turns out there's a very strong intelligent design movement in Great Britain. This movement has made strides in the Middle East. Turkey, for example, actually, the country of Turkey actually surpasses the United States in the percentage of its people that reject the theory of evolution, because there's substantial anti-evolution activity in the Islamic world. I think it's going to be around for a long time. There are always going to be people who, for one reason or another, reject the theory of evolution in spite of the overwhelming scientific evidence behind it. But I do think this, and that is that right now in the United States, this has reached a point of such controversy, where you have people running for public office being asked to comment about it, school board elections being decided by this one way or another. It's reached a point where we're actually at what a systems analyst guy would call a tipping point. And I honestly think this country is going to go one way or another. And as a scientist and an eternal optimist, I think we're going to go the right way. And the right way is by an increasing embrace of the scientific ways of understanding things, and also of an appreciation that science and religion ultimately can be in harmony. So I'm optimistic that that's how things are going to happen. There are always going to be people who oppose evolution, but I think ultimately this country can come out of the current debate with a better appreciation for the nature of science and a better appreciation of the value of religion. Okay, right here, sorry.
How does evolution fit into the origins of DNA?
The origins of what?
DNA.
Well, it's a very good question. And that is, for quite a long time, people investigating the origin of life have wondered which molecule came first. Some very early experiments done with primitive Earth conditions in the 1950s suggested that amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, form quite easily, spontaneously under primitive Earth conditions. So they wondered if proteins might have come first. But of course, nucleic acids, we now appreciate more than we did in the 1950s, carry the information. There's substantial sentiment within the scientific community that DNA is just sort of an offshoot, and that the first information-carrying molecule actually was RNA. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that RNA has a very, very profound catalytic activity. The director, the president, the CEO of the Hughes Institute, Tom Cech, won the Nobel Prize for the discovery that RNA can catalyze certain chemical reactions. One of the reactions that RNA can catalyze is its own replication. That has led a lot of scientists to speculate that primitive Earth conditions formed some of the first bases which became primitive RNA molecules that were capable of coding information and copying themselves. And once you get a molecule that can self-replicate, that means the conditions for natural selection are satisfied. The origin of DNA is a little more mysterious, and the general sentiment, again, and it's sentiment, not strong evidence in the scientific community, is DNA emerged as a kind of safe repository from sort of the cauldron of engaging in chemical reactions. So the DNA was a sort of a storage or archival form of the genetic information that originally started out in RNA. And in fact, one of the questions that my own freshman students at college ask me all the time is, why couldn't a cell make do with just one kind of nucleic acid? In other words, why doesn't a cell have everything in DNA or everything in RNA? And I think the answer to that, basically, is that RNA is now used as sort of a cheap, disposable copy that can be made from the archival copy, DNA in the eukaryotic cell nucleus, which stays out of the fray, and RNA goes out into the cytoplasm and actually does sort of the business of expressing the genetic information. So that's a long way of saying we don't know for sure, but those are some of the thoughts of people who work on the problem. Okay, in the blue shirt, that'd be you.
Obviously, the evidence shows speciation over time, and then like the evidence that you've shown about mousetraps is that elimination of features doesn't eliminate the usefulness of the components.
Right.
But such as in apes to humans, how does environmental stimuli, how can that be shown to increase the genetic information held in humans, not held in apes, which is, I think I heard about 300 million new DNA codons?
Well, the first thing to appreciate is that we humans as a species did not evolve from apes. We didn't evolve from gorillas or chimpanzees or any species alive today. Rather, we and the great apes share a common ancestor in the past. So often people say, well, I didn't evolve from any monkey. Well, no one ever said you did. What evolution says is that we and monkeys, and for that matter all organisms, share a common ancestor if you go far enough back. Now there is, now that we have the chimpanzee genome and we can analyze it, you say there's a certain amount of genetic information we have that's not in the others. Well, it's not that we have more genetic information. We have about the same in terms of numbers of DNA bases compared to the other great apes. But our information is different. And one of the things that investigators have focused on in the last year, since we've had the chimpanzee genome to compare with ours, and there'll be more focus in the next couple of years when we will get both the gorilla and the orangutan sequence, people are working very hard at these right now, is we've been able to pinpoint the spots in our own DNA which have been subject to really, really strong natural selection. And one of the interesting things about this, and this is all very preliminary stuff because the work is just starting to get published, is a lot of these areas of intense natural selection in our DNA concern the development of the nervous system. Now that's really exciting, the brain, among other things. It's really exciting because the most striking thing about our own evolution is that one of our organs increased in size by a factor of 3 in a space of just about 3 million years compared to the other primates. And for some of you in the audience with prurient minds, no, it's not the organ you're thinking of. It's the brain that increased by a factor of 3. How natural selection... I should have been aware of what I'm dealing with in the audience here. The interesting thing is it's been very difficult to understand how natural selection could have favored what is by all accounts an explosive increase in the size of the central nervous system in the brain. We now are beginning to understand the individual genes that were subject to natural selection that control the development of the nervous system, and I'm pretty confident that within a few years of comparative genetics, we will understand the forces of natural selection that drove that increase, and I think more importantly, for the study of our own biology, the genes that actually control our own mental development. So I don't have an answer for you, but I think the answer is forthcoming very shortly. Good question. Okay, right in the corner.
The human genome is getting really close to being done, and some people have been talking about something called the God gene or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you believe in that at all, and do you think it's possible that that could actually exist?
Well, for the strict use of words, I'd say belief plays no role in science. I don't believe in evolution. I don't believe in the Krebs cycle. I don't believe in the eukaryotic cell. I accept those things as the best scientific explanation on the basis of evidence. Belief is for things like theology or baseball or football. You might believe in the Redskins, well, I believe in the Red Sox, and see how it turned out this year. But the notion of the God gene has been popularized by a number of writers in neuropsychology. And what they've argued is that natural selection on our species has given us an innate capacity in our brains to accept religious explanations for things. The great Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson argued this almost 30 years ago in his book On Human Nature. And Ed Wilson argued that natural selection produced this sort of theological capacity which gives us an ability to unite, to join with fellow human beings around myth, ritual, and religious explanations for things. And the reason that prevailed is because those organisms that were able to do that were better at raising food, hunting down animals, making war, and raising children, all of which are important civilized traits in one sense or another. Therefore, that's why we have the capacity to believe in religion. Steven Pinker, a very popular writer on evolutionary psychology, has argued that our brain has a God module, and the God module predisposes us to find religious explanations for things satisfying. Therefore, religion is nothing more than an artifact of this gene or this module in our brain. Now, Steve Pinker is someone whom I've talked with about this, and other people have talked. I've talked with other people about it as well. I think that explanation is generally correct, and I say that even though I consider myself a religious person. So how could you do that? Showing that natural selection produced part of our mental capacity, I think, is no different from showing that natural selection produced the rest of our bodies. And if you believe in a creator, if you believe in a supreme being who used natural processes to bring the physical part of our species into existence, why wouldn't that creator have used the same natural processes to bring the mental part of our being into existence, namely the God module? And if I had to answer Steve Pinker, who says, can you go to church on Sunday because you've got the God module and it's taken you over, I'd say, Steve, natural selection, if it produced our ability to form religion, you know what else natural selection also produced? It produced our ability to do science. And it produced our ability to like and accept rational scientific explanations for things. I wouldn't disqualify science by saying that the brain of someone has a science module, and that's why scientific explanations seem sound and reasonable. And I certainly don't think you can disqualify religion by saying natural selection produced a God module that predisposes you to find religious explanations satisfying. But that's a very good question, and you certainly get a trilobite for that. Okay. Right there, yeah.
What is your view on panspermia or exogenesis?
Panspermia is the notion that life on Earth didn't originate on Earth, but came here from some other place. I find this to be an intriguing notion. I would argue, and I think most biologists would say, that the capacity for life is built into matter. In other words, the very laws of physics and chemistry give what we call inanimate matter, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, the capacity to become alive when arranged in a certain way. I would be astonished, given the vastness of the universe and the constancy of the laws of physics and chemistry, if this little planet zipping around a medium-sized star in a nondescript galaxy was the only place in the universe where that had ever happened. So I'd be very much surprised if life is only confined to this one planet. Do I think life might have come to this planet from somewhere else? It's possible. Meteorites fall into Earth all the time that have organic compounds on them, complex chemicals. Now, how did they originate? We think they originated by the same natural processes that primitive organic chemicals originated on this planet. So that means elsewhere, even in our own solar system, the building blocks of life might be in the process of assembly. I don't think, however, saying that life on Earth arose by panspermia solves the scientific problem of how did life originate. It would just put it on another planet. One way or another, ultimately, a great scientific challenge is going to be to figure out where life came from. Panspermia doesn't get us any close to that, but I think it's an attractive idea given the vastness of the universe and the capacity of matter for life. Right up front. That'd be you.
Do you think there will continue to be breakthroughs in evolution in the future?
It's a good question. Will there be breakthroughs in the evolution in the future? There are breakthroughs in evolution literally every time I open a scientific journal. I see one or another of them. There was a paper about 3 weeks ago that was published in one of the world's leading journals talking about speciation mechanisms, the genetic mechanisms that take a single species and divide it into two and prevent the newly separated species from interbreeding with each other. That's really the first step to forming two species. And what these studies showed is that a very simple single mutation, this was in Drosophila, the fruit fly that we use for lots of laboratory studies, but a single mutation could separate two species so they could no longer interbreed. That was remarkable because prior to that, people thought, as I showed in one of my slides, that this might take years or even decades. We now know that in certain cases it can happen in a single generation. So yes, I think there will continue to be breakthroughs. We continue to find new fossils. A spectacular new fossil was found in Africa just last week, or reported just last week. And finally, evolution is the tool that we use to investigate our genome. In other words, the exploration of the human genome, the DNA sequences that make us human, that exploration wouldn't be possible without using evolution as a tool to compare ourselves to closely related and distantly related organisms to see where natural selection has happened on us. And every time we do that, we find new things out. So I'm confident that new breakthroughs are going to continue to happen. I should have brought a bag with a whole bunch of these. Sir, right in the center, blue shirt, yeah.
So because of these mutations, people change. So do we have actually a method of predicting as to when these possible mutations will take place?
Well, one of the fun things, if you want to call about mutation and genetic change, is that it is to an extent unpredictable. In other words, you simply don't know where errors or mistakes or duplications or translocations of DNA are going to pop up. So in that sense, we don't really know. However, Sean Carroll, one of the people who gave the earlier lectures in the evolution series, pointed out that we animals actually have a genetic makeup that builds the body. In other words, that produces top, bottom, belly, back, head, tail, limbs, segments within our body, which we can actually see in blocks of muscle and blocks of bone and so forth. And the genetic makeup that produces that body, he argues, is actually almost predisposed to produce useful variation. So even though we don't know where the genetic change is going to pop up, the genetic makeup of organisms around today is actually geared to accept that and to produce useful variation. Now, one of the things that evolution does, and this is a technical term, is it explores adaptive space. Now, what that means in a jargon sense is that organisms basically reach out in one direction or another, and it's natural selection that fine-tunes that variation and finds the solution. So if we start to use new antibiotics in our hospital, we can be certain that the bacteria we're trying to kill are going to evolve resistance to those antibiotics. We don't know where the mutations will come from. We don't know when, but we can be certain, because we're creating a form of natural selection, that that can happen. And we see this kind of change all the time. So to that extent, it's somewhat predictable. Okay? Thank you. Right in the center. Yeah.
Do you believe in eugenics?
Eugenics is a word that was coined, actually, I think by Francis Galton, who was the nephew of Charles Darwin. And it generally is understood as describing the process of using genetics to improve our own species. And the answer to that is no, I don't. Because first of all, I think it's naive to believe that we can look at you or me or Dennis or anybody else and say, you know, you're not worth reproducing, we don't like your genes. We're going to let you have a lot of children, or we're going to try to do this sort of thing. For two reasons. One is it's inhumane. It doesn't respect the individual dignity that we all have as human beings. And secondly, it overstates dramatically the extent of scientific knowledge. We don't know that much about human genetics that we can actually say how we can breed or make or otherwise manipulate a better human being. Now, having said that I don't believe in eugenics, because that's the way it's usually understood, I do believe that modern genetics and genomics give individuals the information that they need to make decisions about their own reproductive future. And I'll give you a perfect example of a eugenics-like program that I think has worked extremely well. There is a serious inherited genetic disorder in this country among Jewish people of a certain ancestry called Tay-Sachs disease. It's a recessive disorder. It's extremely rare. If a baby is born who carries 2 copies of Tay-Sachs, what happens is their nervous system breaks down. It breaks down dramatically between the 2nd and 3rd year of life. They usually die before they're old enough to go to kindergarten. It's very difficult for the family. It's extremely traumatic. So what has been operating within the Jewish community for quite a few years has been a program to encourage people who are about to get married to voluntarily get tested to see if they carry 1 copy of this gene. Because if they are then about to marry somebody who carries another copy of it, geneticists can tell them they have a 1 in 4 chance of producing a child with Tay-Sachs. Now they may take that information and decide they're going to try anyway. Or they may take that information and decide, tell you what, let's adopt children, or let's otherwise undergo reproductive interventions that will ensure that we don't bring a child into the world with this horrible disease. But that kind of decision making, I would say, is not eugenics. That kind of decision making is basically giving people the information that they need to make informed decisions about their own lives, and I think that's a good thing. Okay, trying to move things around. Sir.
When do you think that there's going to be evidence of abiogenesis?
Oh, when do I think there's going to be evidence of abiogenesis? Abiogenesis is a term means life coming from inanimate matter. Well, depends what you mean by that. Some people would say that abiogenesis took place about 10 years ago. And it was 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, I think, when scientists took chemicals off the shelf, put them into DNA synthesizers, synthesized the DNA molecule of a virus, and then were able to reconstruct a virus particle. So if you consider viruses to be living, that's abiogenesis. A very well-known scientist, Craig Ventnor, who worked on the Human Genome Project, is now trying to do exactly the same thing with a real cell, not a virus, a bacterium, trying to construct a minimal organism. Knowing this guy, within a few years, he's probably going to succeed. So that sort of ability to take non-living chemicals and put them and make them come alive by mimicking the living cell, I think that's pretty close. The larger question that I think you're asking is how soon is it going to be that we will have an answer to the riddle of how the first living cell originated from non-living chemicals on this planet. I'm not optimistic that it's going to happen anytime soon. And the reason for that is it happened a long time ago and it didn't leave much evidence. But there are a number of researchers who have put together pieces of the puzzle. And I'm certainly confident that that's exactly how it took place. Jack Szostak at Harvard has done some absolutely brilliant work that involves self-replicating RNA molecules and a number of simulations of conditions on the primitive Earth. So I certainly think that it happened that way. But in terms of achieving a total understanding, I think we're a couple of decades away from really understanding how life originated on this Earth. Good question. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for the opportunity.